We have a wonderful session, and I'm very excited to introduce our speakers. Let me tell you a little bit about it. As you probably know from reading the program, the topic is, what is the role of white leaders on the path to educational equity? And when I was asked to moderate this conversation, I thought this is a great topic for the 25th anniversary summit. I was here on the 20th anniversary summit. I serve on the TFA board, the national board, and I was here as a board member 5 years ago. And I recall when the core values were being introduced and there was a lot of excitement about it. And one of those core values was, of course, the importance of diversity and the need to have more teachers of color in classrooms so that students of color would see themselves reflected in those spaces. Certainly we heard how much progress, I have been hearing certainly, how much progress has been made toward that goal. Now 50% of the incoming core has been made up of teachers of color, and that's tremendous progress for TFA. But I'm also aware that for some people it has raised some questions, maybe some personal questions, recognizing that yes, this is an important goal to increase the presence of teachers of color in the classroom, but what about white core members? What about white educational leaders? What is their role on the way to the path of equity? And for some people, that's been a very personal question, as in, where do I fit in this picture? What is my role? So I thought it was really exciting to bring together some very dynamic educational leaders to talk about this very question today as part of the 25th anniversary summit. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our plan for the morning. We have 4 dynamic educators, and each of them, I'm going to introduce them shortly, but each of them is going to come forward and share their perspective on this question for 5, 6, maybe 7 minutes. And then when each has had a chance to do that, we're going to have a conversation, a dialogue together, kind of a roundtable conversation. And then we're going to open the floor for your questions. So I hope you'll have some great ones, and we will look forward to a very dynamic and engaging conversation about what is clearly a very important topic, because we know it's not either or. It's not either teachers of color or white teachers in the classroom. It really is both and, that it is going to take all of us to make the progress we want to see. And I am very eager to bring forward some leaders who have been doing just that. So let me start with my introductions, for which I need my glasses. Okay, so our first speaker I'm going to bring forward is Dr. John Dacey. I would describe Dr. Dacey as a superintendent's superintendent. He's led multiple districts across the country. In Rhode Island, not very far away from here, in Prince George's County, and here in Maryland, in Santa Monica, California, and most recently in Los Angeles. He's now superintendent in residence at the Broad Foundation, working with other school leaders, but at the core of his lifetime of work is the deep belief that children come first, and that with privilege comes responsibility. He acknowledges his own privilege as someone who is white and male and certainly tall, and our job is to dismantle. Height does confer privilege. I just want to tell you that, standing here. I want to quote something he said to me in our phone conversation in preparation. He said, "Our job is to dismantle the hegemonic power structure and lift kids out of poverty." I think that's a bold statement from a bold leader. Please welcome to the stage Dr. John Dacey.
Thanks, Beverly.
Thank you. Thanks. Our second speaker, you're not speaking just yet, but thank you. My lack of clarity, I appreciate that, John.
Sit down.
Our second speaker, I'm going to bring everyone to the stage, and then they're going to speak in turn. And the first voice we will hear after mine will indeed be Dr. John Dacey. Thank you, John. Okay, our second speaker will be, I'm doing all the introductions so you'll know what's coming. Our second speaker will be Jenny Niles, who is the Deputy Mayor for Education here in Washington, D.C. Her job has she's got a wonderful mission, and perhaps daunting, She is responsible for developing and implementing the mayor's vision for academic excellence and creating a high-quality education continuum from birth to age 24. That is certainly a daunting task, but she brings to that task her experience as founder and former leader of the award-winning E.L. Haynes Public Charter School, serving a diverse population of 1,200 students. She is an award-winning educational leader, and she too has thought deeply about our question, what is the role of white leaders on the path to equity, from her own lived experience. I'm very excited to hear what she has to say, and I want you to please welcome to the stage Jenny Niles. Thank you, Jenny. Our third speaker will be Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, who is the Associate Professor of Raza Studies and Education Administration and Interdisciplinary Studies at San Francisco State University. He wears a lot of hats because he's also the co-founder of the Teaching Excellence Network and a high school teacher in East Oakland. A practitioner and researcher, he has written a number of books, but at the core of his work is his study of the use of critical pedagogy in working with urban schools and urban students. The key question for Jeff is, what are the characteristics of effective urban teachers? So it is through this lens of understanding the core competencies of highly effective urban teachers that Jeff will reflect on our question, what is the role of white leaders on the path to equity? Please welcome to the stage Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade. Thank you. And our last speaker is well known to this audience, or certainly should be, and she is the woman who grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, experienced firsthand the transformational power of education as a student, then as a 1998 Corps member in Phoenix, as a leader and mentor of other teachers, rising through the ranks, and now as CEO of Teach for America, where she is committed to building the best organization possible. Please welcome ELISA Villanueva Beard. John, I know you're excited. It's your turn. Thanks so much.
Very slowly. Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I'm not a Corps member, but I probably could never have done my job without the Corps. So I always take this moment of privilege. For anybody who served the youth of Prince George's County or Los Angeles, I am profoundly grateful, and I thank you, and I thank your families for letting you do that work. It's hugely, hugely significant and important, deeply appreciative. I thought your comment about height was hysterical. I actually used to be 6'6", but then I took this job in Los Angeles, and you just kind of get pounded down. So I'm really only 5'10" now. I thought a lot about...
It's all relative, John.
It's all relative. So I thought a lot about this issue. I have thought a lot about this issue across the arc of my life and my career. And one of the things I'm very aware of is the imperfection of language. And I'm just going to speak from clearly my heart and my conscience. And if language is either provocative or it makes folks uncomfortable, then I give you the permission to hold me accountable for that. But I will be completely honest on this topic because I think it's incredibly important. I've chosen to work in communities of places where the overwhelming majority of youth live in circumstances of peril and in great circumstances of poverty. And I consider that an incredible privilege, but it's also very haunting. They're absolutely acutely aware of my own privilege, both earned and unearned, and being a white male leader in this very, very important space in this country. And I think with that obligation to serve goes the responsibility to think deeply about my role and my colleagues' role in this work. And I think this issue of equity has been front and center of how I have thought about leading. And I would argue that it's been impossible to do justice to youth if you are not firmly grounded in this issue of equity. And as I've thought about that, the way that I've come to understand my role in folks who look like me is that it is very much to willfully and deliberately use both the gifts and the privileges that we have to both dismantle a hegemonic structure in this country of white power and white privilege, and to use that privilege to lift others. I think privilege is really a simple decision. You either hold on to it and amass it for your own good, or you use every bit of it to lift others. And I only know the way to do that is you have to give that away. And you use the structures that you have the opportunity to legitimately build that in others. And the way I've thought through that has been around the tools that one uses for youth. And I think about youth a lot, and I think that their rights are a very, very special thing. And when you have something really special at home, you usually put it in a box so you don't lose it. And when I go into systems, and be very clear, there's a great deal of forces that are there to support students, and there's a great deal of forces that are there that conspire against youth rights. And for me, when you are going to make the center of all of your work the rights of students, then the four corners of that box for me are negotiation and regulation and legislation and litigation. And I believe that one of the roles that I have chosen to do is to go after all four of those at the same time so that nothing conspires against the rights of students, whether that is their right to access, whether it is their right to acquisition, or their right to develop good agency. Not advocacy, but agency. And in doing that, one of the things that I have really watched in this country, and I think we're at a particularly painful point, at least this is how John Dacey sees that at the moment. And I think we're at a point, at least by my take, of watching an uncivil war take place in this country. And the very language that is used so frequently is a language of hatred. And it is a language of disempowerment. And I don't use that word lightly. I think civility is in short order. And I think that the greatest thing I personally fear is that someone's going to write a letter again in the near future, very much like King did, imprisoned in Birmingham City Jail, and somewhere around the 30th paragraph is going to be the next writer's deep disappointment in the white moderate. Like, where were you? Where were you? And I have to answer that question for me. And I don't want the answer to be, I talked about it. I don't want the answer to be, I thought about it. What I want the answer to be is that I don't know how to do it perfectly, but I'll be damned if I won't do anything. And that something really is to intervene, I believe, in this uncivil warfare that is going on. I mean, we're shooting and killing people on our streets, almost with impunity. We are willfully putting people into poverty, white, black, brown, and otherwise. And we have a constructed set of laws and a constructed set of policies, I think, conspire to keep youth in poverty. And I've chosen to go after those things and to lift those opportunities up for students. And that is the way that I think I want to be able to do something. And so when there were laws in California which deliberately and willfully criminalized young black men, we sought to change those at a school level and could not be more proud of what took place in LAUSD when I joined the system, 53,000 suspensions a year, and the overwhelming majority of those suspensions, like more than 90%, were for a single item, willful defiance. And of that, the majority of those are young black students, and that is not the majority of students in LA. And so when we looked at all of those suspensions and had very difficult conversations, really painful conversations around that, what we found is students were being suspended, and I quote, failing to be prepared for class, not picking up a paper off the floor, looking at me in a threatening way. That is actually not a criminal behavior, that's adolescence.
Yes.
And yet the deliberate activities of a system to continue to ticket and to suspend and actually facilitate a school-to-prison pipeline is untenable. So therefore, you strike that down, and then you go to the state, and you say that willful defiance cannot be a law in California anymore to do that. And then I think that there are other laws, and this is controversial, and I own my role in this, and I firmly stand in my role in that. So when laws around last in and first out take place, and we have just worked really hard to fill our classrooms with new, not necessarily younger, but new professionals, and a very diverse set of professionals in the most impacted schools. And you know how this is going to go. And then when you actually have to lay people off because the state can't seem to fund students at 1/6 the rate that they fund them in prison, as versus public school, you have to lay off that whole new group of people without any regard to talent or their opportunity. I actually think that is wrong. And so when the Vergara case came forward and spent days on the stand, and the judge basically thought that it was unconscionable that the way that this affected young people, those were struck down. And those are but two examples. And the third example I'll leave us with this morning as I think about this has been this issue of wage justice. I remember very vividly union walking up to me and saying, like, we get all this lifting youth out of poverty stuff. Like, that's great, and, you know, go for it. But how do you possibly expect to lift youth out of poverty if you keep their parents in poverty? And it began a very dead serious conversation about minimum wage. And in a series of important and groundbreaking places, we became the first place in America to go to the $15 minimum wage in the year 2015. And as we know, the 15 and 15 has moved on around that. So 3 examples of exercising the opportunities that sat in front of me in ways that lift others. I think a lot about what is being recently written by our author, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I think a lot about my comment about where the state of this country is, politically and economically, education-wise, in this very uncivil war and discourse. And at least as I finished reading his 3 most seminal pieces for me, which is The Case for Reparations, Between Me and the World, and The Disappearance of the Black Family, I believe he leaves me as a reader when he says he expects nothing anymore from me. And he makes the case for reparation. And I believe that he can and will continue to expect nothing unless I and others find our role to do something. And I believe that reparations are necessary but not sufficient. That the role I think I must continue to play is one of demanding truth and reconciliation in this country. If we learned anything from South Africa, it was that reparation is not possible without truth and reconciliation. And that requires, in my opinion, very difficult, very honest, imperfect language, of course, conversations about very much this single topic. And I want to be checked when folks think I'm wrong, And I want other brothers and sisters around me, when folks think that I have missed an opportunity to have used the very blessings and responsibilities of privilege and have not done enough. And it is not as simple as filling my classrooms with colorful, brilliant teachers and our schools filled with colorful and brilliant leaders. It is the support to make sure they navigate through a yet-to-be totally torn down hegemonic white power structure, so that in your 25th year from now, we don't sit on the stage looking like this. Those are kind of my initial thoughts about this work. Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you so much.
White racist bitch. That was my greatest fear when starting a school, was that that's what an angry parent would say to me. And I wanted to share that because it shows you where I was starting from. Honestly, if that was my biggest worry, I didn't have a lot of other worries. 2, it's invariably going to happen, so might as well happen sometime soon. And 3, I was somebody and am somebody who cares tremendously about social justice and don't want to be a perpetrator of it. Instead of talking about the role of leader, I thought I'd give a few words about the role of person, or some things that are directly related to me, and see if that's useful to those of you in the room. So as I mentioned, walking on eggshells, I think, was the first part of my life, where certainly had lots of practice talking about justice, social justice, equity, racial equity, all sorts of words, but not talking about race across difference.
Welcome to TFA.
And, ooh, hi, Fernando. And so in this journey, I would say that the key thing that has been most important for me is that the reason that many of you may be in this room, and the reason that many of us have excelled, have been because we've been able to set goals, have metrics, meet deadlines, and analyze the heck out of everything. And I offer to you that unfortunately none of those things are what's going to get us to the other side. And what do I mean? I mean that when I started out thinking about being a white leader, and that's where I was starting, because I was going to start a school, so it was sort of in the same, I first was trying to solve all of these issues that relate to the fact that we live in a racist society, and that our institutions in the United States are built on a racist past and therefore have racism embedded and endemic into them. And so here I was thinking about starting an organization that invariably was also going to have racist components of it, no matter how hard I tried or the other folks tried with me to not have that happen. But it didn't, when I started, I don't think that I realized the inevitability of that. And by not realizing the inevitability, I thought that I could technically solve it, when in fact it's not a technical solution at all. I had to get used to sitting in the fire. And about 6 years ago, I was lucky enough to have my first hire for the school that I started was Michelle Molitor. Many of you may know Michelle. And 6 years ago, we started having conversations at Yale Haynes that was giving us the will, skill, and courage to have conversations about race across difference. And the first year, all of our staff members went through the seminar on race and equity in education. And then we moved it so that every new staff member would partake in this as their first 3 days as being on staff. I participated in each one of those and never missed one. And certainly that there was some usefulness It was an incredible way to get to know people. It gave me insights about the dynamics that might come up in the different divisions of the school. And symbolically, many people commented to me that it was powerful for the leader of the institution to always take that time to do it. But the reason that I did it was actually because I needed practice. And I need practice to this day. As somebody once recently mentioned to me, it's not unlike flossing. You floss in the morning. Guess what? You got to floss at night too. And we've got to keep flossing because of just what John was saying. We've got to, this is so endemic into what our society is, that if I weren't an aggressive, naive optimist, I might be overwhelmed by the daunting task of actually ridding our society of the racist structures that exist and the racist beliefs that we have. But this notion of sitting in the fire is one, so that was what was going to practice. And sitting in the fire meant being open and knowing that I was going to get burnt every single time. And what getting burnt meant was that I got to hear my staff tell me that we had created a hiring process that had one experienced white woman have one interview and an experienced black woman have 4 interviews. How the hell did that happen? When I learned that it was reflected back to me that I had skipped over an experienced person of color for a coaching job and given it to a junior white member of our staff. I could go on with these things, and as they were shared with me in these contexts, each one was a dart in the heart. But then, how big a deal is that? So while it was personally painful, when I would make mistakes, and sometimes they were fairly big mistakes, as I just mentioned that they were endemic to our institution, or that they were living out in our institution, it compares nothing to what it meant to be a person of color in the past and in the present who could make a mistake and lose their life. And so the notion of me having a pierce in my heart was really small and insignificant. But I had to get the being in the fire is actually being comfortable. And so all those years that I spent trying to not be racist, walk on eggshells, never make a mistake, the answer for me right now is very simple. I need to be willing to get burned. And that means that I have to be myself. And I have to sometimes, I was just joking, maybe my name is Jenny Microaggression Niles. But and then have conversations across difference. And so that, I think, there's no amount of planning as a leader for your organization and solving you can do or should do until you're sitting in the fire. This would be my recommendation, is to sit in the fire. Then actually all the rest of it begins to make a little bit more sense. But it's too comfortable as a person of privilege to analyze things. It's total comfort zone. Give me a really complex problem and I'll break it down for you into 5 steps and then we will tackle each one. Once it goes there, it's now out of my heart and into my head. And this is a solution. I need to tackle the heart part. If I was to say, though, the role of the leader after being in the fire and squarely putting myself there and then having to keep myself there, and so I was really honored when asked to be on this panel. And first I was a little nervous, and then I thought, what better way to be in the fire? Get potentially burned by 1,000 people in the room. But there's a part that is, and I am not a history person or a particularly articulate religious person, but there's a cleansing or there's a healing, there's a cauterizing of when burned, facing that and being able to move on to the next thing. But I do think that in addition to the personal work that each person of privilege and dominant culture needs to do, we need to do 2 other things. We need to give up power. And I actually think that we can now use the analytic structure to figure out how we're actually going to give it up. And the other thing we can do is figure out how to awaken the white moderates. As John mentioned, Dr. Martin Luther King was most worried about white moderates. And I think that there's a lot of responsibility for us to change our society, but I would suggest that perhaps those of us who are white dominant culture folks tackle the white moderate as on our to-do list. So I'll stop talking now.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm going to start by acknowledging that we're on indigenous land and to ask for permission from my indigenous ancestors to share some palabra with you today. And with that permission, I want to also acknowledge two folks who, I really wasn't wanting to come to this thing at all. And ELISA said to me that I needed to acknowledge the fact that, that I'm TFA alum from long before it was TFA as y'all know it. I was in the second year of the Corps in Oakland. And I acknowledge TFA infrequently because schools of ed weren't recruiting me to become a teacher in my community, but TFA did. And some of the dopest teachers of color that I know around the country, cats that's still in the gig, 15, 20 years later, got into teaching through Teach for America. So TFA is a mixed bag. And, I'm on record all the time, highly critical of TFA as well, because of the direction that it's gone and the sore spots that are becoming increasingly clear, I think, not only to the nation, it's been clear to our communities for a long, long time, but increasingly inside the organization. And so, I wasn't really sure that, that I wanted to come and walk away from my community where I serve every day and come here and be part of this thing. And Paul Keyes and ELISA really pushed hard on me to come. And I respect y'all for doing that and am appreciative of the fact that you did. And I'm glad I'm here and get to share a few words over the next couple of days with some of you. So on this question of the role of white leaders on the path to equity, I guess I would start by saying the first thing that white leaders need to do is acknowledge that we live in a racist, classist, homophobic, patriarchal society, point blank, period. So that's the starting point, right? All the data, right, is crystal clear about that fact. It's not even debated in public health and social epidemiology and in neuroscience, right? It's not even debated anymore, right? So let's just end the debate, right? And start there, right? Confront, as Baldwin said, right? The material conditions of our lives in this society as the starting point, I think is a good place to start. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Bryan Stevenson. If you're not, you should be. But he's done some amazing work in the justice system or injustice system, depending on what your zip code is. And he tells this story. He has this great interview about race in the United States that you can look up. I think it was on CNN or MSNBC. Anyway, it's one of the best analyses of race in the country that I've read. Anyway, he tells this story about how his work has become increasingly noticed around the world, and so he was invited to Germany to do some talks and meet with their leadership, their national leadership, and so they're taking him around the country and kind of touring him, and these are top level government officials, and they keep showing them these sites all over the country where there's these government placards and signs that say something to the effect of, on this site, on this day, the German government slaughtered 500 Jewish people. And it's like all over the country. And he's like, what is this about? And they look at him and they say, the only way to make sure that something like this never happens again is to make sure that no one forgets that it happened. And he's like, yo, that's deep. So he's like, I'm going to do that in the U.S. I'm going to go back, right? I'm going to go to the South, and I'm going to talk to all these folks, because, they decided to take the flag down, so maybe they're ready for something else. I'm going to go to the South, and I'm going to get these placards put up all over the South and say, on this spot, on this day, the United States government executed, lynched 50 African people. How you think that's going? Right. This country has a fundamental problem with truth-telling. It refuses to name, confront, and atone its two original sins: the theft and genocide of native people and land, and the theft and genocide of African bodies and labor. And in D.C., where a black man stands in a house built by African enslaved labor, is one of the deepest contradictions, right, that we refuse to wrestle with as a nation. And that's why y'all are so important. Because in one generation, we can flip that. In one generation, right, we can make that a core part of the instructional paradigm of this nation. In one generation, every child can begin to confront the two original sins of this nation so that we can begin to heal. But without the courage, character, and commitment amongst all of our leadership, then we'll continue down this road. And make no mistake about the interconnectedness of the fact that my community members get gunned down in the streets by so-called peace officers, and that legacy and our unwillingness to acknowledge that legacy. They're deeply connected. And so I would go one step further than John and say, yes, we need to talk about white power. Yes, we need to talk about white privilege. But undergirding all of that, is a system of white supremacy. And that one makes folks a little bit more uncomfortable. We've gotten comfortable, talking about white power and white privilege, some folks anyway. But the word white supremacy still unsettles people. And until we deal with the fact that it's a supremacist vision that led to what happened in Germany, by default, it was also and remains a supremacist version of a national sensibility that led to the genocide of Native people, the genocide of African people, and the ongoing devaluing of black and brown and poor lives. So I would argue that an important starting point for white leaders is to deepen your understanding about race. We have such a Pollyannish, infantile understanding and analysis of the very concept of race, where it came from, how it works in our day-to-day society. And so how are we going to tackle white power, white privilege, and white supremacy when we don't even understand the historical origins of race in this country? Not at any really deep level. So there's another paradigm, okay, that schools must address, okay, if we're going to become a multiracial, pluralistic democracy. We've got to sophisticate our understandings about the very concept of race, how it manifests, how it plays itself out in our daily lives. Okay? And only at that point, okay, can you really look in the mirror and understand what it means to be white, okay, inside of a highly racialized, white supremacist nation state. You know, the national data, depending on who you talk to, you get numbers that are a little bit different, but I'll use NCTAF's numbers. NCTAF suggests that 86% of the national public teaching force is white and 84% is female. Who's doing the worst in schools? Right? And look, you would never catch me saying, okay, that white folks can't teach kids of color in the same way you would never catch me saying that folks of color can't teach white folks. Okay? But those numbers are so out of balance when we know, hey, that by 2020 in conservative estimates, right, the majority of public school kids are going to be kids of color. Right? That's a fundamental challenge, okay, for any leader, right, particularly for white leaders. Okay? And I know that this is something that TFA has been wrestling with, but hey, let's not presume that just because you get black and brown teachers in front of black and brown kids, that black and brown kids are suddenly going to be like, oh, thank God, I'm excited to come to school now. Because I've seen black and brown teachers that are whack. So no free pass, right? And truth be told, right, black and brown folks, okay, have a generally weak understanding, okay, of how race operates in this nation state. Because we went to the same schools, well, actually we didn't go to the same schools as y'all, but we went to public schools too. Okay? And we also weren't taught, right? So we have our lived experience around race, right? But we don't have the kind of analytical, deep understanding of the historical origins of race in this country to wrestle with the things that we're wrestling with, okay, ourselves. And so the earlier comment about, like, you know, oh shit, they're gonna call me a white racist bitch, and I figure if you could say bitch, I could say shit. Is, you know, I think white folks got to get comfortable with the fact that almost certainly, okay, you are dealing internally, okay, with real racist tendencies. You are racist. How could you not be living in this society if folks of color are wrestling with elements of white supremacy, hating ourselves for the color of our skin, hating ourselves for the texture of our hair, hating ourselves for the language that we speak, the cultural paradigms that are normed in our homes, hating our hoods? Of course you all are wrestling with elements of racism and white supremacy internally. Okay? That's all right. Can you name it? Can you own it? As a starting point. Because if you don't, right, then you're just playing games. And we ain't got no time for games. Time for games is long gone. We are suffering. This nation is suffering. Oxford says that Robert Putnam, bowling alone, recently our kids from Harvard's Kennedy School, Oxford calls Putnam the world's most influential scholar. Dubious honor. Putnam argues that we're perhaps a generation away from being over the cliff as a society. We're so fundamentally far from the democratic principles, the rhetoric of the Constitution, that this question, okay, is one of the most important ones. Okay? Not so much about what white leaders are going to do, but what we're going to do as a nation to really finally come to grips with how we started, okay, and what that means for us today, okay, and where we're going to go. So I'll end by saying that I would challenge white leaders to start from a place where you stop thinking that you know what we need in communities of color. Humble yourselves. If you're going to come in and lead in our community, first ask permission to lead in our community. The education of our children is sacred work. The fact that we send them to you doesn't mean that we trust you. You made laws that forced us. So we send them with great fear and trepidation about the harm that will be done to them in this school system. So before you begin designing your latest, greatest whiteboard plan, because you know the shit always works on the whiteboard. Before you put pen down on paper, ask permission. Being elected by a group of people that we didn't even elect is not permission from the community that you're aiming to serve. And be sure that you're always checking in with our elders to ask permission for the work that you're doing. And if we don't give you permission, you don't have permission. You have the power to do it anyway. But power and permission are two very different things. So start there with an acknowledgement that you don't know what we need. And open up that dialogue to really begin to think about how, as a leader, you're going to be committed to not only fundamentally reshaping the very purpose of public education in this nation, but along that journey, that part of that purpose has to be, as both of the previous two speakers said, the redistribution of wealth and power. But the redistribution of wealth and power can only happen in a truly just, moral way if what is preceding that is the work that I talked about already, a fundamental understanding about why there is such tremendous imbalance in wealth and power in this society, and the role that white supremacy, race, and racism have played in that. But I would also end by saying that when I work with white leaders around the country, white teachers around the country, what I find is that they often, in their own white guilt, take up this position that is self-pitying and that is really oriented around a deficit model of themselves. White people, you're beautiful. You're beautiful human beings, just as we are. And you must start with an asset-based model. Don't think about what you're not bringing to the work. Think about what you are bringing to the work. If you start with this vision of yourself as not capable, if you start with a deficit vision of yourself because you're white, that self-hating paradigm will get in the way of you really loving us. It really has to begin with you loving yourself for being white, which means that you've got to do work on understanding your own indigeneity. Who do you come from? Who are your people? Who are your ancestors? And so the project, of ethnic studies shouldn't just be for folks of color. White folks need them some ethnic studies too, real talk. Because only from a place of self-love, not self-loathing, but self-love, can this work in partnership really be done. And so the challenge that I give to white leaders is to move from a place of sympathy to empathy. That's the move. Right? As long as you are sympathetic to the suffering of poor people and people of color, you're of no use to us. Empathy, the pathway to being empathic, is the ability to understand that your humanity is connected to our humanity. That my suffering is your suffering. And as long as you understand that your freedom is directly tied to my freedom, then we can go on a journey together. And we won't be talking about anybody following anybody else, right? But we'll be locked in solidarity around a singular purpose, which is that we actually live up to the highfalutin rhetoric of a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. I am an eminently hopeful person. It's why I stay in the classroom. Because when you're around those babies who literally walk through war zones just to get to our whack-ass teachings, they make me so hopeful that we could swing this thing so fast, because they still believe, even though there are so many signs, so many indicators that would suggest to them that belief is unwarranted. So when you doubt, tap into that. When you doubt, go hang out with the babies. And they will put all that aside. And they will remind you that this work is not about you, and it's not about us. Right? It's about these babies. Thank you.
I'm so glad you came, Jeff. Thank you. And thank you to Jenny and John for their remarks, and for obviously Beverly, who's just incredible. So I was thinking after them what would be helpful to share, and I'm just gonna share a story. So as Beverly said, I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, and for those of you that are not familiar, it's right on the border of Texas and Mexico, predominantly Mexican-American community, and I ended up in college in Midwest rural America. And when I got there, it was quite different than the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, as you might imagine. It was the 3% Latino, 5% Black, and a very different world for me at 18. That I was confronting. I started to make lots of incredible friends, and one weekend I went home with one of my friends, and we were in the kitchen making dinner with her mom, and her mom is asking me about my family and my background, and she very clearly hears me say that where I'm from. And we keep talking, and she is making spaghetti, I think it was, and says, Mexicans are cleaning people. And I could not believe that that's what she said, because she clearly knew that I was Mexican. And I remember sitting there in shock with a big lump in my throat and my stomach. I felt like I had just gotten punched. And all that was going through my head was, oh my God, does she really think that? There's no way she can think that. My mom's a florist, and my dad works for the government, and my principal in elementary school was a principal. Does she really think all Mexicans are cleaning people? And does she think I should be a cleaning person? I go to college with her daughter. And I was at a phase in my own journey where I was struggling at school. I was a high-performing kid at my high school, ended up in college and realized I was underprepared. And so I'm struggling with my own place, I'm struggling with my own confidence, asking myself, do I belong here? And then I have this woman say this, and all I wanted in that moment was my friend, who was becoming like my best friend, to say something. I wanted her to say, Mom, Don't be ridiculous. You don't mean that. You know better. Elisa's Mexican. She is in college with me. Her mom's a florist. Her dad works for the government. Mom, don't say things like that. That's all I wanted her to say. Because in that moment, what ended up happening is this message goes deep down into this, soul that is dark place where you just carry a lot, and then there is a punch in your face, and you realize like you carry lots of punches in your face because you do not take on these conversations because it's just not worth it sometimes, but then you internalize that and it goes someplace, and you come to realize no one around you sees the punches on your faces and the scratches on your faces, and all you want is for someone to say something because it's crazy. And that's one of the big messages I have for you all. You all have heard it deeply from these three speakers, but that little act is a starting point, and it is hard to do, you all. But I get asked all the time to be on these diversity panels. I don't do them anymore, and if I do, I might consider it if at least half the people are white, because the burden is not on me to solve this. I have to fight, and I fight every day, and I have told within Teach for America, people have heard me say this, I've taken this as far as I can, friends. I need the rest of you to step up. I need the rest of you to step up. And so that is one of the things that we've just really have to own, because we've heard our destiny is tied together, and I believe deeply that we need to be a diverse community, and that we all have to understand our asset, our power, and our privilege in this work, which are different, and we just have to confront that. And I believe that in order for this to change, we've got to reach every dinner table in America, from Darien, Connecticut to rural Alabama to South Texas, but we've got to be centered and understand our power and our privilege in this work that we are doing, and I know that it is hard. So as I was thinking about this last week and what I might want to share, one of the things I think we don't talk enough about is how hard it is to confront finding your voice in your own networks and in your own families, and in I should say because we all have dark things in ourselves and with the people around us that we love. It made me think about this. It made me think about this experience that I don't talk about ever, and I've never certainly publicly talked about it, and I don't talk about it at work, but I thought it was worth sharing because I think we need to get real about how hard this stuff is to take on. My older sister, married a black man, and my grandma did not go to the wedding. And when she got engaged, my grandmother said, we do not marry black people. And she went on to tell us what black people were. And she would say this only within our family, of course. And in my culture, you don't talk back to authority, and you certainly don't question authority. My grandmother, who I deeply love and respect, but I was in college when this happened, and I was like destroyed by all of this. So she never said this, obviously, in front of my brother-in-law, but no doubt he felt the spirit of her hate. She didn't go to the wedding. Wedding passes. I cry every time I go to my grandma's house because I can't believe I'm going to go see my grandma, who I love, but I know thinks this, and I say nothing. One day I go by my grandma's house, and no one is there. There's always someone there, and she makes coffee, because we always have coffee, and we sit down, and I remember just looking at her and saying, Abuelita, can I ask you a question? And she's like, of course. And I asked her, do you know any black people? And she said, no. And so then I asked her, then why do you say these really awful things about black people? Because I have friends who are black, and I have a brother-in-law who is black, and it's not true. We ended up having this very emotional conversation. She didn't realize that it impacted me the way that it impacted me. And I asked her just never to talk like that in front of me again. And I don't know what happened to my grandma's heart that day or over time, but lots of things happened in a lot of circumstances. And my sister was married for, many years. My parents obviously stood by her. We stood by her and supported her. And my brother-in-law, I ended up marrying a black man 7 years later. She did come to my wedding. I don't know what she thinks today. She just turned 91. But my grandma's someone I love. And I say all of this because we have to be able to just confront how hard this is, and that we have our own stuff, all of us, in ourselves and in our families, and we are imperfect. But we need to show up, and we need to step up. And we're in a phase now where, because Teach for America, we start this work and we say this is about race, class, and privilege. And if that makes you uncomfortable, Teach for America is not the right place for you, because we're never going to make progress unless we start there. And what it has led to is our white colleagues, my white colleagues who I love, asking themselves this question of, do I fit in? Is there a role? Do I feel guilty? Do I step out of the way because I need to let others be the leader in this moment? We do need a lot more people of color who are leading in decision-making seats, and that is true, and we've got to continue to work toward that. But we also need every American, because this is an American problem. We need every white leader, everyone certainly that has chosen to join Teach for America. I know what your heart is. You are for justice, you are for equity, and we need every voice lifted, awake, and wanting to run into the fire with us. And it is uncomfortable and it is hard. And I think for many years, it was on the person of color to have to say whatever and be brave in that moment. So my charge to my white colleagues is, I need you to be brave. Our children need you to be brave. You've had the privilege of meeting kids, and I know we all have empathy towards our kids. We deeply understand a lot more than we did before we met our children, and that is a privilege. And so let's be truth tellers, let's be awake, let's use our voices and our privilege, because we will not get there until we decide to do that. Thank you.
I want to begin our conversation by first thanking each of our presenters for showing up. We appreciate what you've had to say. Please join me in giving them a round of applause again. And I also know we don't have as much time as I wish we had, because there's so much to talk about in this conversation. And I want to give at least a little time for you all to ask a question or two. I've got a timekeeper over here who's going to help me with this process. But I want to start because there's so much wisdom. I've heard a lot of wisdom on this stage. But I'm thinking about my own experience as someone who taught the psychology of racism for a long time, particularly my experience working with white students who often were trying to figure out how to get from where they were to where you all have come in your understanding from your different perspectives. And so I want to start with you, John, because you gave, a very powerful set of remarks about what you're doing now as, for lack of a better term, an adult. But I want to, someone with a lot of experience and a lot of commitment. But I want to ask you how you first became aware that you could do that. Can you take us back to the beginning of your journey or earlier in your journey, how that awareness started to unfold for you?
I don't know. To be frank, I think you put snippets together of a maturation process. I think part of it was really being blessed by people who would say, like, that's a really stupid way to think, and that is immature, and you need to be a much more mature person. And I think people intervened at points in my life and basically called me to be a better man on this issue. I think that's a great thing. Very hard conversation. I mean, there's always the family stuff. I really so appreciated your story, because I think every one of us has stories like that, that are that are almost impossible to verbalize. So I think very early on, early growing up, parents were certainly, we struggled as a family financially and all of that. But busing, I came from New England, Boston, Providence, and that was a major defining moment, I think, in my understanding. Like, I fundamentally didn't understand, like, why people would not want black and white people to go to school together. I didn't understand it. It was not a concept that I could understand. So I, by a lottery of genetics, came into a white family who believed that, like, there's something fundamentally wrong if you don't support integration. And not a sophisticated thing. I mean, when my father was sober, he would actually yell about why this is a bad thing. That people were doing this. And then realized, I think as an athlete, that that was the awareness of my first understanding of the necessity to win, of being a teammate. And that was, again, a blessing at that point in life. But I think in the times when things were very racially volatile, it almost always came to a head when a team would play sports, and you'd have visiting and home teams, and how you as a team acted on the field and the court usually meant whether there'd be a riot in how the school would behave and the other things like that. And so there was this issue of, I just thought it was like, I just don't want to get the crap beat out of you. But it was this sense of responsibility early on that you have a role to play in this. And you have a role to play, but not alone. So I think that was it. And then as I slowly matured, very slowly matured into an adult, I think what you said, I think, is very much true to me. The early part of my life was in youth corrections and then became education. And youth voice has been the single greatest shaper of my life. And I'm very lucky for that.
Thanks.
That's the short answer. It's nothing dramatic. It just is what it is.
One of the things that, Jenny, you talked about, thank you, John, for sharing that, but Jenny, one of the things you talked about was, your fear of being called out as a racist. And one of the things that I know from my teaching experience is that particularly when white students, that's how I'm going to describe them, my white students, would start to think about how to interrupt the racism in their environment. I'm thinking about your friend, was silent in that moment, but I'm imagining now she's in my psych of racism class and she's telling about what happened when she brought her Mexican-American friend home with her and she didn't know what to say, and she's struggling with that. And then as she starts to figure out what to say, she gets pushback. Maybe as you did in your conversation with your grandmother, but pushback from friends in the environment. I often talk about the fact that we're all on this cycle, participating in this cycle of racism, other isms, and when we try to interrupt the cycle, there's often social pressure to be silent. And so, Jenny, I'm wondering if I'm sure you've felt that. I can't imagine you haven't in the work that you've done, but if you could talk a little bit about that for people who may be feeling that pressure now.
Sure, I think that. Great, I think that works.
Yes.
Yes,
there you go.
great.
There you go.
The fear of interrupting, definitely. I think that it's interesting. I think that the fear of interrupting was not as great for me as perpetuating a mistake myself that I wouldn't know I was doing. But the fear of interrupting, I think that as I gained more language and desire and willingness, actually I'm not sure it was a desire, but the willingness to step in and interrupt what I was seeing, just this past holiday, it sort of came perhaps a little full circle. So when I was in college, I was very outspoken, and so my dad and I fought the whole time. And a lot of that was about me questioning the way I had been brought up. and I had also been brought up in a very loving home and all of these things. And so I think that it was sort of rocked my parents to their core when I was critiquing that or trying to understand that. But the interrupting part, then I got so that I was interrupting a lot. And interrupting so much that I could tell that some of the folks who I'd grown up with were probably avoiding me. And that wasn't necessarily a problem, but I think that just this last, over the holidays, a friend of my parents came up to me who's a white man who I don't think has had a lot of experience with folks who are poor. I don't think has had a huge amount of experience with folks of color. And he came up to me and he said, so tell me what's really going on at Yale. I don't understand why the professors got in so much trouble. And I was actually, felt great that he had asked me in that tone. I was in a different place than the person who those folks knew that I was an interrupter, and so that I had actually, they couldn't come talk to me. They wouldn't. I don't know if that's the pendulum swing or somebody who's discovered something new and is just the evangelist. And so I was really pleased that he had approached it in that way. And then we had a really rich conversation, and he's not somebody who I ever would have thought would have asked the question with the ears of empathy, rather than just of, it's crazy, those Halloween costumes, everybody gets to wear what they want for Halloween, or something like that. Yeah. So I think that it's over time of how to figure out how to interrupt, and how to keep the conversation going. Because while I can interrupt so that there might be a symbolic moment, we also need folks' minds to change. And so it's how to interrupt and change minds.
Thanks. I'm really wishing I had more time up here. And I have promised at least the opportunity to ask a question from this large audience. We probably will have time maybe for one question. So if you're burning to have a question, you need to get to the mic. But before you do, I want to give Jeff and Elisa a chance to either make another comment or ask a question from the stage that you've been thinking about based on what you've heard so far.
I'm good too. I think the one thing that I will say that I just think is really important is what you were saying here, Jenny, at the end. This whole how do we engage with like love and grace and know when it's outrageous, and we should be firm and outrageous when things are outrageous. But how do we find the common ground to keep people in the conversation? I think is a skill that we all have been working on for some time, and the power of that, because people need to stay at the table. That's the whole point, right? Like we have to keep people at the table, which means we have to somehow figure out how do we get to a place of grace and love when appropriate. And I understand sometimes it's not appropriate, but I think that's something that I personally have observed and watched and keep pushing myself to figure out how to do even better.
Great. I think we've got someone ready with a question.
Sorry, my burning question's about money. So I think I'm the first person in 6 years, a white person, to run an organization in East Harlem. We run after-school programs, charter schools, teacher training programs, lots of things there. And my struggle is, I think as a white person, one, recognizing bias and racism that I'm a part of, and two, trying to recognize the role of money. And I think there's a lot of critiques into the sector around what's been called education reform, that it is funded by white people. And as we heard the panel, many panelists talk about, this is a history of power, and racism was used to marshal resources to get rich, land, etc. And there's a lot of critiques I think we do have to acknowledge that as we bring in private money into the sector, that is a very real threat. More than half the country in 20 or 30 years will be non-white, and they have the tax dollars, but private money comes largely from white people. And so I wanted to ask the group, how do we square that, whether it's big groups like Teacher America or residency and superintendent programs, whether it's groups like ours, where obviously resources are critical, but we have to recognize the impact there in our choices.
I'd like to speak to that, actually. And one of the things that I would say, I'm thinking about a conversation I was part of a few months ago involving philanthropists, and one of the conversations was really about the willingness to make bets on people of color. You know, that there are a lot of organizations, startup organizations by young white people that get highly invested in, and there are organizations, similar kinds of organizations or different ones, but equally effective, maybe even more effective, led by people of color that can't get investment. And that is a demonstration, I think, of the problem of white supremacy and racism in action. Not necessarily intentional, but nonetheless the same, unless we really think carefully about how do we decide where to make our investment. I'm going to use my own example, my own experience as president of Spelman College. I retired in July. Spelman is the most effective educator of women of color in the United States. That said, it's not the most highly invested in. We raised a lot of money, but certainly there are organizations not nearly as effective receiving gifts much bigger. So the question is, you know, where do people decide to use their resources if they have them? And how do we think about that in a way that interrupts the cycle? The last thing I want to say relative to your comment, I think, which is important for us to think about, is how we really work across lines of difference and keep those conversations going. Because I think that the silence that everyone has alluded to here and about these issues does not serve us well. I'm reading a book right now, which I think is a fabulous book, and I just want to mention it, put in a plug for it. It's called Brown is the New White. And if you haven't heard of it, it's about actually electoral politics, but it's about the changing demographics of our nation. We know that people of color will be the new majority, but the author talks about not necessarily that change, but what could happen if people of color and progressive whites work together in coalition. It would be an unbeatable majority in terms of public policy, in terms of legislation, et cetera. So I think it's something that we all have to think about. I'm told we have, John, did you want to say something?
I'm just going to make a comment. I actually think the question's a very important one. I'm just going to express how I have thought about this. So in my role when I was superintendent, frequently philanthropy would come knocking and say, we want to do X, Y, and Z. I actually don't put any energy into thinking about super crazy, wealthy white people giving their money away. They can do whatever they want with it. I think about who takes it, and I think about the taking end of it. And so you can't force people to take your money. It's a decision to take that money. And the decision that I think where I can exercise power is both saying yes and no when people want to offer funding. I chose to say no universally in the last position because people didn't want to invest, and you can spend your money any way you want. God bless you if you got it. But I don't actually have to take it. And so I think being clear about what I want funded, what I want supported, is the way that I choose to exercise conscience in that role. And so I'm just kind of not down for that agenda, so therefore, please go find someone else who is and take their money around that. And I think that is the way that I have thought through that.
Can I just say one
Sure.
thing? I also think this is an important question, and I think it's very complex. And so I agree. I mean, we at Teach for America, there are certain people that we're never going to take funding from. And we obviously take money from a lot of other people that everyone in this room is familiar with, and probably, you know, and I'm in this conversation a lot about the questions people have. One, I see two things with this. One is Dr. Tatum here alluded to our responsibility, and the way Teach for America has seen our responsibility is we convened our biggest philanthropists in Memphis to have this conversation around race. And we see that as a responsibility because we do have the ears and the support of a lot of people who are thinking about giving, and this was a prominent part of the conversation about, and we had just a mixed group of people who were saying, you all don't give to people that look like this, and they didn't realize they weren't giving. They didn't, oh, I don't mean to not give to people who look like that. And it's just confronting the conversation, and so I see my responsibility and our responsibility to actually have that conversation. And we have incredibly generous people who are trying to do the right thing every day, and so I'm very hopeful about our ability to just raise awareness and start to have tough conversations even within our own philanthropist community. And I also think, like, you know, I've been reaching out to lots of different groups. Civil rights groups take money from places that people question where we take money, and it's all just very complex. And so I just think getting to the root of what, like, how we're going to move the agenda forward most quickly for our children is really important, and how do we stay centered on our values and what those limits are, I think is important, which we are having at Teach for America.
I'm told we've got 1 minute left, so I actually am not going to take any more questions. I'm very sorry about that. But I do want to give Jeff the last word, because we haven't heard from him on the stage, and what I would like beyond at the podium. And I'd really love for you, in this last moment, I'd like to ask the question, because I'm sure you are daily dealing with students, not just the ones in high school. I'm thinking about the college students who come to you and say, you know, what can I do? How do I get started? If they're brave enough to ask that question, I'm thinking about those white students who may cross your path. Imagine they're sitting out here. What's your advice?
Well, I'll just echo some of the stuff that I said in my opening remarks, which is, I think a lot of what I heard today was this kind of parsing apart of what I understand to be the difference between systemic infrastructural racism, which I referred to as white supremacy,
Yes.
And prejudice, which is this idea that individuals have a responsibility, right, to engage in either speaking up or lifting up these issues. And so I see the work that you all, that we all have to do together as really breaking down that binary and not seeing those two things as necessarily disconnected. That everyone in this room has a responsibility to speak. And somebody earlier mentioned silence, right? Silence comes from disconnectedness. Okay, so if you find yourself falling silent in the moment of truth, okay, what we call social justice moments, SJMs, get that tattoo somewhere on your body, okay? And it's your button, right? When an SJM presents itself, just touch your tat, okay? And then you just be, yeah, okay? And you know, in my community, we literally refer to that as armor, right? Many indigenous communities, right, put ink on our bodies, right, because we're armoring ourselves, and it's literally a way, right, a constant reminder of our responsibility to our children and to our ancestors. So if you find yourself falling silent, okay, that is evidence that you are disconnected from your own humanity. Okay, you're not disconnected from me. You're not disconnected from these people that you say you want to intervene on, but you're disconnected from yourself. When you can't find the courage, the character, and the commitment, you can't muster those things up in the moment of truth. Okay? So do the work on yourself, right? Figure out how am I so disconnected, right, from myself? And then understand that individual work, right, will help you to find that voice in that SJM, in that social justice moment. But in that social justice moment, it's not just about altering that social justice moment. It's also lifting up the truth that moment is presenting itself because of the structural elements of white supremacy and racism, okay? So don't let it just fall onto, well, you're just, you know, one bad apple, or you've just been miseducated, or you just need some re-education, right? That it's connected to a larger system of things, okay, that we have to also be willing to tackle. And that's why I think the work with the babies is so important. I have very little hope in the people in this room, including myself, because we're grown. And as you get older and you get deeper into this system, hey, there's a way in which that your thinking gets truncated and curbed. But when you talk to children, right, their belief in what's possible is unfettered. It's unchecked, okay? And so tap into that, right? But for me, it's really, I don't believe, okay, that anyone in this room, okay, or this collective in this room, okay, is actually going to create the change that we want to see. But I do believe we can create the conditions for this next generation of kids to create the change that we want to see for this next generation of kids. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.